Ji-won Park pressed her palm against the glass door of Baekdu restaurant, the flagship of Min-jae Kang's 7-establishment empire, and felt the weight of the wire taped between her shoulder blades like a brand. The FBI had sewn it into the lining of her blazer 3 hours ago in a Culver City safe house, and Special Agent Morrison had looked her dead in the eye and said, "The dog can smell electronics. If it goes for you, we pull you out." She'd nodded then, but now, watching the pure white Akita rise from its position beside a mahogany desk visible through the restaurant's back office window, she understood that Morrison had been lying. There would be no extraction fast enough to save her from 140 pounds of trained aggression. The dog's eyes, black as crude oil, tracked her movement as she pushed through the door, and she thought of her father's hands, scarred and twisted from 20 years of training military dogs in Koreatown before he defected with nothing but those scars and a manila envelope of techniques the Kim regime had declared state secrets. The hostess, a Korean-American girl who couldn't have been older than 19, smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who'd been taught that tips depended on it. "Do you have a reservation?" "I'm Ji-won Park," she said, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline making her fingers twitch. "Mr. Kang hired me as his new bookkeeper. I'm supposed to start today." The girl's smile crystallized into something more cautious, and she lifted a phone from the hostess stand, speaking rapid Korean into it while her eyes never left Ji-won's face. Through the office window, the Akita hadn't moved, but its ears had swiveled forward, radar dishes locking onto a signal. Ji-won had studied the files Morrison had given her until the words blurred. Baekdu, male, 4 years old, trained in North Korea using methods outlawed by every international animal welfare organization in existence. 5 hospitalizations. 17 stitches in a sous chef's arm. A busboy who'd lost 2 fingers when he'd gotten too close to Min-jae's desk carrying his phone. The dog didn't just bite. It systematically dismantled threats. "Mr. Kang will see you now," the hostess said, hanging up the phone with a soft click that sounded like a hammer cocking. Ji-won walked through the restaurant's dining room, past tables set with white linen and chopsticks wrapped in paper printed with the restaurant's logo, a stylized mountain that represented Baekdu Mountain on the North Korean-Chinese border. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Min-jae Kang's grandfather had crossed that border in 1950 with a Russian pistol and enough gold to start a new life. His father had turned that gold into a protection racket that kept Koreatown safe from the Bloods and the 18th Street Gang. Min-jae had inherited an empire built on violence and transformed it into something that looked almost legitimate from the outside: 7 restaurants, 2 nightclubs, a karaoke bar that did $4 million in revenue annually. The FBI had spent 3 years trying to penetrate the organization's financial structures, and G1 was their surgical strike, a forensic accountant who could read money trails the way her father had read the body language of attack dogs. The office door opened before she reached it, and Min-jae Kang stood in the threshold like a man posing for a portrait. 6 feet tall, 36 years old according to his driver's license, wearing a charcoal suit that cost $6,000 based on the cut and the way the fabric moved when he shifted his weight. His face had the kind of symmetry that fashion photographers built careers on, all sharp angles and perfect proportions, but his eyes were flat in the way that G1 had learned to recognize in her work, the look of someone who'd made cost-benefit analyses about human life so many times it had become reflex. "Mississippi Park," he said, extending a hand. His English carried only the faintest trace of an accent, the kind that came from someone who'd been educated in international schools and spoke 4 languages fluently. "Welcome to Baekdu." She shook his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm that didn't match the suit or the manicured nails. Fighter's hands, disguised under the veneer of legitimacy. Behind him, the Akita watched with an intensity that made her skin prickle, and she forced herself not to look directly at it. Her father had taught her that before he'd taught her anything else: never stare down a trained attack dog unless you're prepared to commit to the fight. "Thank you for the opportunity," she said, releasing his hand and stepping past him into the office. The room smelled like leather and the ghost of cigarette smoke, expensive cologne layered over something sharper, gun oil, maybe, or the particular scent of fear that soaked into walls when violence happened regularly. "Your previous bookkeeper's records were immaculate. It'll be a pleasure to maintain that standard." Min-jae's smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. Mr. Salm was with my father for 20 years. His retirement was well earned. He closed the door with a soft click, and Ji-won heard the lock engage. Unfortunately, his methods were somewhat old-fashioned. I'm hoping you'll bring a more modern approach to our operations. The Akita stood, and Ji-won's body tensed before she could stop herself. Every muscle in the dog's frame was visible under its coat, definition that spoke to a training regimen that went beyond simple conditioning. It moved like water, fluid and purposeful, crossing the distance between its bed and Ji-won in 3 strides. She could smell it now, that particular scent of a well-maintained working dog, clean coat, healthy skin, the faint metallic tang of the raw meat diet that kept its teeth sharp and its instincts sharper. Baekdu doesn't like strangers, Min-jae said, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the 140-pound predator currently circling Ji-won with its nose extended. Most people find that concerning. Ji-won stood perfectly still, arms at her sides, breathing slowly through her nose. The wire between her shoulder blades felt like it was burning, a point of heat she was certain the dog could sense. She'd studied the footage Morrison had shown her, watched the busboy screaming as Baekdu tore into his hand, seen the systematic way the dog had targeted the phone in his pocket first before moving to flesh. The FBI's animal behavior specialist had been clear. The dog had been trained to detect electronic signals, the specific frequency patterns of recording devices and transmitters. It was a technique that originated in North Korean counterintelligence, something her father had mentioned once in the haze of soju and nightmares that characterized his last year before the liver cancer took him. The Akita's nose touched her hip, snuffling along the line of her blazer, and Ji-won felt sweat break out along her spine. Wrong spot. The wire was higher, tucked between her shoulder blades where the FBI technician had promised it would be undetectable. The dog moved up her side, its breath hot through the fabric of her shirt, and she saw Min-jae's hand drift toward something under his desk, gun, button, panic switch, it didn't matter. If Baekdu signaled, she was dead or compromised, and either outcome meant the last 8 months of preparation had been wasted. She thought of her father, not the broken man who died in a Glendale hospice, but the version she'd constructed from fragments and nightmares, the one who trained dogs to find landmines and deserters and anyone the regime deemed dangerous. He'd told her once, in Korean because some things didn't translate, that the key to controlling an attack dog wasn't dominance or affection. It was understanding that the dog had been broken the same way she'd been broken, and that recognition created a bridge nothing else could cross. Baekdu's nose reached her shoulder blade, and she felt the moment of contact like an electric shock. The dog went rigid, every muscle locking, and its lips pulled back from teeth that could crack bone. Min-jae's hand moved faster, and Ji-won did the only thing her instincts would allow. She dropped to one knee and spoke a phrase in Korean that she'd heard her father scream in his sleep, Joyongi, Jialmian Jiansa. Quiet, young warrior. The Akita's head snapped toward her, eyes wide, and for a moment Ji-won saw past the training and the violence to something else, confusion, maybe, or recognition of something it hadn't heard since it was a puppy, learning that pain was the only reliable constant. The dog's body language shifted, aggression bleeding into uncertainty, and it sat abruptly, ears flat against its skull. Min-jae's hand froze halfway to whatever he'd been reaching for. How did you know that command? Ji-won stood slowly, keeping her eyes on Baekdu, watching for the telltale signs that its training would reassert itself, the hardening of its gaze, the tension returning to its muscles. My father trained military dogs in North Korea before he defected. He used to say that phrase in his sleep. She turned to face Min-jae, calculating the risk of honesty against the impossibility of lying about something this specific. I didn't think it would work. I've never trained dogs myself. If you're reading this and your heart is pounding like mine was writing it, go ahead and subscribe, because what Ji-won doesn't know yet is that Min-jae's uncle trained Baekdu personally, using techniques he stole from defectors like her father, and her presence in this office is about to trigger a war that will force her to choose between the badge she carries and the man she's supposed to betray. Min-jae studied her with an intensity that made the wire between her shoulder blades feel like a noose. Your resume said your father worked in animal control in Seoul. You said he managed a kennel. I simplified, Ji-won said, meeting his gaze and letting him see the truth there, or at least, enough truth to make the lie palatable. Defectors don't put their real employment history on job applications. It tends to complicate visa interviews. He moved then, crossing the space between them in 2 strides, and Ji-won's training screamed at her to step back, create distance, maintain the professional boundary that would keep her identity as FBI asset separate from whatever persona she'd constructed for this cover. But she held her ground, because stepping back now would confirm his suspicion, and suspicion in Min-jae Kang's world was the same thing as a death sentence. Your father, Min-jae said, his voice dropping to something quieter, more dangerous. What was his name? Park Sung-ho, she said, giving him the name that appeared on her father's death certificate, the American name he'd chosen when he'd arrived in Los Angeles with nothing but scars and secrets. He died 2 years ago. Liver cancer. Min-jae's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, calculation, recognition, the kind of mental arithmetic that criminals did when they were weighing the value of information against the risk of exposure. Baekdu was trained in the DPRK, he said, using the acronym for North Korea that only Koreans bothered with. My uncle bought him from a broker in Yenji. He was 18 months old, already vicious. The broker said he'd been trained using old KPA methods. Korean People's Army. Ji-won felt the pieces sliding into place, a puzzle she'd been solving without realizing it. Her father had worked in Koreatown, training dogs for the border guards who shot defectors trying to cross into China. If Baekdu had been trained using those methods, it meant someone had access to techniques that weren't written down anywhere, knowledge that existed only in the hands and memories of trainers who'd survived the regime's camps. Her father had been one of maybe 30 men in the entire country who knew how to create a dog like Baekdu, an animal that could detect electronics, distinguish between hostile and friendly targets, kill on command without hesitation. Your uncle, she said carefully, aware that Min-jae was watching her face for any sign of deception. Where is he now? He runs our shipping operations, Min-jae said, stepping back and gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Sit. We have work to discuss, Mississippi Park, and Baekdu has decided you're not a threat. That's more trust than I've given anyone in 5 years. Ji-won sat, feeling the wire press against her spine, wondering if the FBI was hearing any of this or if the signal was blocked by the office's walls. Baekdu followed her, settling at her feet with its massive head resting on her shoe, and she felt the weight of it like an anchor. The dog's breathing was steady, calm, the nervous tension from moments ago completely vanished. It trusted her, or at least, it trusted the command she'd spoken, the phrase that had apparently unlocked something in its training that predated the violence. Min-jae opened a laptop, the movement casual, and Ji-won saw Baekdu's ears swivel toward the device but its body remained relaxed. The dog had been trained to differentiate, computers were safe, phones were safe, but anything transmitting was a threat. The FBI's tech team had sworn the wire was undetectable, operating on a frequency that wouldn't trigger standard sweeps, but they hadn't accounted for a dog trained by North Korean intelligence methods. Her father had told her once, during one of his rare sober nights, that the KPA's dog trainers could condition an animal to detect the electromagnetic signature of a wire at 15 feet. She'd thought he was exaggerating, the way he exaggerated most things when he was trying to make his old life sound more significant than the broken reality of his new one. Our books are clean, Min-jae said, turning the laptop toward her. Or rather, they appear clean to anyone who doesn't know what they're looking at. Mr. Song was an artist in his way. He could make 3 million in cash look like restaurant revenue without triggering a single flag. Ji-won scanned the spreadsheet on the screen, her trained eye picking out the patterns immediately, the inflated food costs that masked cash payments to suppliers who didn't exist, the employee roster bloated with names that probably belonged to dead men or people living in Korea, the real estate holdings that changed hands every 18 months to avoid scrutiny. It was textbook money laundering, elevated to an art form by someone who understood that the IRS didn't have the resources to investigate every Korean restaurant in Los Angeles. This is impressive work, she said, because it was true and because lying about technical competence was the fastest way to blow a cover. But there are vulnerabilities. The frequency of your property transfers is going to attract attention eventually, and your employee turnover rate is statistically impossible unless you're running a sweatshop. Min-jae's smile was genuine this time, reaching his eyes in a way that transformed his face from dangerous to merely intense. That's exactly what Mr. Song said 3 months before he retired. He told me we needed someone younger, someone who understood how the federal agencies were adapting their algorithms. He closed the laptop, the gesture final. Your job, Mississippi Park, is to make our operations invisible. Not clean, clean is for amateurs. I want our books to be so perfectly average that no analyst will ever flag them for review. That's going to require restructuring your entire financial architecture, Ji-won said, her mind already running through the possibilities, the ways she could map his operation while appearing to protect it. I'll need access to everything, bank accounts, property records, supplier contracts, employee files. If I'm going to make you invisible, I need to see every shadow you're trying to hide. You'll have it, Min-jae said. He stood, smoothing his suit jacket, and Ji-won saw the bulge under his left arm, shoulder holster, probably a compact 9mm, something that wouldn't print under expensive fabric. But understand something, Mississippi Park. The people who work for me fall into 2 categories, family and assets. Family I protect until my last breath. Assets I use until they're no longer useful, and then I eliminate them before they can become liabilities. Mr. Song was family. You are an asset. Don't confuse the two. The threat was delivered with the same pleasant tone he'd used to welcome her, and Ji-won understood that this was the real Min-jae Kang, the one who'd inherited an empire and expanded it through calculated violence and perfect discipline. She stood, feeling Baekdu rise with her, the dog's shoulder pressed against her thigh in a way that felt almost protective. I understand, Mr. Kang. I'll have a preliminary analysis ready by Friday. Call me Min-jae, he said, extending his hand again. We'll be working closely, and formality creates distance. Distance creates mistakes. She shook his hand, feeling the calluses again, wondering what kind of training had created them, boxing, maybe, or the kind of knife work that left scars on palms when the blade slipped. Ji-won, then. He released her hand and opened the office door, but before she could leave, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. My uncle will want to meet you. He takes a personal interest in anyone who works with our finances. When he asks about your father, tell him the truth. He has ways of verifying information, and lies about family history tend to end badly in our organization. Ji-won nodded, stepped through the door, and felt Baekdu's nose bump against her hand, a gesture that was almost affectionate, if affection could exist in an animal that had been systematically brutalized into a weapon. She walked through the restaurant, past the hostess who watched her with new wariness, and pushed through the glass door into the brutal Los Angeles sunshine. Her car was parked 3 blocks away, a Civic that the FBI had equipped with enough surveillance equipment to coordinate a small invasion, and she made it 2 blocks before her hands started shaking. The wire between her shoulder blades had been silent the entire time, no signal, no transmission, which meant Morrison and his team had heard nothing. Either the office was shielded, or Baekdu's presence had somehow interfered with the frequency, or the FBI's tech team had screwed up in a way that was going to get her killed. She pulled out her phone, saw 3 missed calls from Morrison, and let the phone ring 4 times before answering. Are you compromised? Morrison's voice was tight, controlled, the tone of someone who'd spent the last hour imagining worst-case scenarios. No, Ji-won said, leaning against a storefront window and watching the street for anyone who might have followed her. But the wire didn't transmit. The dog detected it, but I managed to deflect. We need to meet. Griffith Park, 2 hours. Northeast parking lot. Morrison hung up without saying goodbye, standard protocol for field communications, and Ji-won pocketed her phone and tried to control the adrenaline crash that was making her vision blur at the edges. She'd been in Min-jae Kang's office for maybe 20 minutes, and in that time she'd learned 3 things that the FBI's 3-year investigation had missed. Baekdu had been trained in North Korea using her father's methods. Min-jae's uncle was the real power in the organization. And she'd just been read into an operation that was going to require her to rebuild the financial infrastructure of the largest Korean crime syndicate on the West Coast. The moral complexity of the situation settled on her shoulders like a physical weight. The FBI's brief had painted Min-jae as a simple criminal, a third-generation gangster running protection rackets and laundering money through legitimate businesses. But the reality was more complicated. His organization did provide protection for Koreatown, keeping out the gangs that would have turned it into a war zone. His restaurants employed hundreds of people, many of them immigrants who couldn't get work anywhere else. The money he laundered came from gambling and loan sharking, victimless crimes by the standards of organized crime, and nothing in the brief had suggested he was involved in drugs or trafficking. If you're starting to wonder whether G1 can really go through with betraying a man who might not be a villain, hit that like button, because the next person she meets is going to make her question everything she thought she knew about justice, family, and the cost of survival. 2 hours later, G1 sat in her Civic in Griffith Park's northeast lot, watching Morrison approach through the rearview mirror. He was 43, black, carrying the kind of physical presence that came from 20 years in the FBI's organized crime division. He'd recruited her out of Ernst & Young, where she'd been tracking money laundering for clients who paid her $200,000 a year to make their problems disappear. The FBI had offered her half that salary and a chance to use her skills for something that mattered, and she'd been naive enough to believe that the distinction between client and target was the same thing as the distinction between right and wrong. Morrison slid into the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the parking lot for surveillance before he spoke. The wire stopped transmitting the moment you entered that office. Whatever shielding he has, it's military grade. What happened? G1 told him everything, the dog's training, the command her father had used, Min-jae's uncle and the shipping operation, the threat that had been delivered with a smile. Morrison listened without interrupting, his face impassive, and when she finished he was silent for 30 seconds before responding. "This is better than we hoped," he said finally. "If the uncle is running shipping, that's how they're moving product. We've had surveillance on their legitimate imports for 2 years and found nothing, which means he's using different channels. If you can map their finances, you'll expose the whole network." "What product?" G1 asked, hearing the edge in her own voice. "Your brief said gambling and loan sharking. You didn't mention drugs or trafficking." Morrison's expression shifted, becoming the carefully neutral mask of someone about to deliver information that changed the game. "We didn't have confirmation until last month. The uncle, Kang Dae-young, runs a defector pipeline out of China. He smuggles people out of North Korea, charges them $50,000 per person, and then sells them into forced labor when they can't pay. We've identified at least 30 victims in the last 5 years, women working in massage parlors, men in garment factories, all of them trapped by debt they can never repay." The bottom dropped out of G1's stomach. Her father had been a defector, had paid someone like Kang Dae-young to get him across the border and into China, and then across the Pacific to Los Angeles. He'd never talked about how he'd paid that debt, but she'd been old enough to remember the years when he'd worked 3 jobs and come home smelling like grease and fear. "Min-jae," she said, her voice barely functional. "Does he know what his uncle is doing?" "We don't know," Morrison said. "The nephew keeps his hands clean, runs the restaurants, plays the legitimate businessman. But he has to know. You don't run an organization that size without knowing where the money comes from." G1 stared through the windshield at the parking lot, at the families spreading picnic blankets and the teenagers throwing frisbees, normal people living normal lives, while she sat in a car and learned that the man whose empire she was supposed to infiltrate might be complicit in the same kind of trafficking that had nearly destroyed her father. "You want me to continue?" "I want you to get close enough to map the operation," Morrison said. "Find the accounts that are handling the trafficking money, trace the payment chains, identify the victims. Once we have that, we can move on the entire organization, not just Min-jae, but his uncle and everyone involved in the pipeline." "And if Min-jae doesn't know?" G1 asked, turning to face Morrison. If he's being used by his uncle the same way I'm being used by you. Morrison's face hardened. Then he's a criminal who's been running protection rackets and laundering money for 15 years. He's not a victim, G1. He's a gangster who happens to have a charming smile and a dangerous dog. Don't confuse your operational success for personal connection. She wanted to argue, to push back against the simplicity of Morrison's moral calculus, but she knew it was pointless. The FBI didn't deal in shades of gray. You were either a criminal or you weren't, and everything else was just noise that complicated prosecutions. What about the dog? What about it? Baekdu, G1 said, the name feeling strange in her mouth. It was trained using my father's methods. Whoever trained it stole those techniques from defectors like him. If I'm getting close to Min-jae, I'm going to have to work with that dog, and it's going to know things about me that I haven't told you. Morrison's expression shifted to something like concern, or at least, the professional approximation of it. The dog is a tool. It detects electronics, it attacks threats. It doesn't have opinions about your father or anyone else's. Don't anthropomorphize the weapon, G1. That's how assets get compromised. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and Morrison opened the door and stepped out of the Civic. Next contact in 72 hours unless you're compromised. If you need emergency extraction, use the signal we discussed. And G1, he leaned back into the car, his face serious, don't get attached. Not to the man, not to the dog, not to anyone in that organization. They're targets, not colleagues, and the moment you forget that is the moment you become a liability instead of an asset. He closed the door and walked away, and G1 sat in the parking lot and tried to organize her thoughts into something resembling a plan. She had 3 days before Min-jae would expect her preliminary analysis, 3 days to build a financial map of his operation that would satisfy him while simultaneously exposing the vulnerabilities that the FBI could exploit. It should have been straightforward. She'd done similar work dozens of times for clients who needed their assets protected from IRS scrutiny. But those clients had been corporations evading taxes, not men who smiled while threatening her life, and their operations hadn't been built on the broken bodies of people like her father. The next morning, G1 arrived at Baekdu restaurant at 7 a.m., 2 hours before the lunch shift started, and found Min-jae already in his office with the dog at his feet. He looked up when she knocked, his expression shifting from focused to welcoming in a way that might have been genuine if she didn't know better. "You're early. I like that. I wanted to start with the property records," she said, stepping into the office and feeling Baekdu's attention lock onto her like a targeting system. The dog rose, approached, and she held still while it snuffled along her legs and torso, searching for electronics that weren't there. She'd left her phone in the car, had worn different clothes, had done everything possible to avoid triggering the dog's training. When Baekdu sat and leaned against her leg, she felt a surge of relief that was almost physical. "He likes you," Min-jae said, watching this interaction with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "That's never happened before. Usually it takes months for him to tolerate new people, and even then he barely accepts their presence." G1 knelt down, letting the dog push its massive head under her hand, feeling the solid reality of it, muscle and bone and the faint tremor that suggested trauma buried so deep it might never surface. "My father used to say that dogs trained with violence recognize their own kind. Maybe Baekdu sees something in me that reminds him of his training." It was a risk, admitting that much, but Min-jae's expression shifted to something like understanding. "Your father was tortured." "He was a trainer in the KPA, G1 said, the lie coming easily because it was wrapped in enough truth to feel authentic. "They don't distinguish between the trainers and the dogs. Pain is the only reliable teacher, according to the philosophy." He had scars that covered most of his back. Min-jae was silent for a moment, and G1 saw something cross his face, empathy, maybe, or the memory of his own exposure to violence. "My uncle has similar scars. He doesn't talk about where they came from, but I've seen them in the bathhouse. Burns, mostly, and marks that look like restraints." This was it, the opening she needed to ask about Kang Dae-young without appearing to investigate him. "Your uncle, will I be working with him directly, or just reporting through you?" "Both," Min-jae said, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. "Uncle Dae-young handles our shipping and imports, which means he controls most of our cash flow. You'll need to coordinate with him to understand how money moves through the organization." "When can I meet him?" "Tonight," Min-jae said, standing and crossing to a filing cabinet that looked like it belonged in a museum. "He's invited you to dinner at his house in Palos Verdes." "It's not a request, Uncle's invitations are commands disguised as hospitality. But where's something nice? He judges people by their presentation, and first impressions matter in our family." Ji-won felt ice form in her stomach. Palos Verdes was 30 minutes south, expensive real estate overlooking the ocean, the kind of place where privacy was measured in acres rather than feet. If Kang Dae-young wanted to question her in private, there would be no FBI surveillance, no backup, no emergency extraction that could reach her in time. "What should I expect?" "Questions," Min-jae said, his voice dropping to something more serious. "Uncle will want to know about your father, your training, your loyalties. He's paranoid in the way that only survivors can be, and he doesn't trust anyone who hasn't been tested. Answer his questions honestly, he can smell lies the way Baekdu can smell electronics." "And if I fail his test?" Min-jae's expression didn't change, but his hand moved to Baekdu's head, fingers tangling in the dog's fur in a gesture that might have been affectionate or might have been reflexive. "Then you won't leave his house, and I'll need to find another bookkeeper." "But you won't fail, Ji-won. You're the daughter of a defector who survived the KPA's dog training program, and that means you understand survival in ways most people don't. Uncle respects survivors." Comment below if you're getting chills, because Ji-won is about to meet the man who not only trained Baekdu using her father's stolen methods, but who's been trafficking defectors like her father for profit, and she'll have to sit across from him at dinner and pretend she doesn't know he's a monster. That night, Ji-won drove south on the Pacific Coast Highway in her Civic, watching the ocean turn gold and then purple as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Morrison had called an hour earlier, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, and told her in no uncertain terms that she was to wear a wire to this meeting regardless of the risk. She'd refused, explaining that Baekdu would detect it immediately, and Morrison had threatened to pull her from the operation. She'd hung up on him, the first time she'd ever done that to a superior, and turned off her phone before he could call back. Whatever happened at Kang Dae-young's house, it would happen without FBI oversight, and the thought was either liberating or terrifying depending on how she chose to frame it. The address Min-jae had given her led to a gated compound on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, the kind of property that required a net worth in the 8 figures. She pulled up to the intercom, gave her name, and watched the gates swing open with the smooth precision of expensive engineering. The driveway curved through manicured gardens, past fountains and sculptures that looked like they belonged in museums, and ended at a house that was more compound than residence, concrete and glass, modernist architecture that prioritized views over warmth. A man in a black suit met her at the entrance, Korean, mid-30s, with the kind of stillness that marked him as security or muscle or both. He didn't speak, just gestured for her to follow, and Ji-won walked through the house's entrance into a space that took her breath away. The entire back wall was glass, floor to ceiling, overlooking the ocean that stretched to infinity. The interior was sparse, almost austere, low furniture, minimal decoration, the aesthetic of someone who valued control over comfort. Kang Dae-young sat at a dining table position to face the view, and Ji-won felt recognition hit her like a physical blow. He was 61 according to the FBI's file, but he looked older, worn down by something that had nothing to do with age. His face was hard angles and scar tissue, one eye slightly lower than the other in a way that suggested reconstructive surgery. But it was his hands that caught her attention, twisted and scarred in the exact pattern she'd seen on her father's hands, the marks of someone who'd spent years working with animals that fought back. "Mississippi Park," he said in Korean, his voice rough, damaged by something, cigarettes, or screaming, or the kind of injury that left permanent changes. "Sit. We have much to discuss." Ji-won sat across from him, feeling the weight of his attention like a physical thing. Behind him, standing in the shadows near the glass wall, she could see two more men in black suits, and she understood that whatever happened here, violence was always an option. "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Kang. Call me Dae-young," he said, switching to English that carried a heavier accent than his nephew's. "We are family now, in the way that matters in our organization. You work for my nephew, which means you work for me, and family doesn't use formalities." He poured tea into 2 cups, the gesture ritualistic, and pushed one across the table to her. "Tell me about your father." Min-jae said he trained military dogs in the north. This was the moment she'd been preparing for since Morrison's call, the point where truth and lies would have to blur into something convincing enough to survive scrutiny. "Park Sung-ho," she said, using her father's American name. He worked in Koreatown, training border dogs for 23 years before he defected in 1998. He crossed at Koreatown, paid a broker in Yenji, and spent 2 years working in a factory before he could afford passage to South Korea. Dae-young's expression didn't change, but his hands, those scarred, twisted hands, tightened on his teacup. "Koreatown. I know Koreatown. I trained dogs there myself, before." He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Before covered a multitude of sins, a lifetime of choices that had led him from North Korea to this cliff overlooking the Pacific. "My father said the training center in Koreatown was the best in the country," Ji-won said, watching Dae-young's face for any sign that this was landing wrong. "He said they could create a dog that could detect defectors from half a kilometer away, that could differentiate between loyal citizens and enemies of the state." "Your father was correct," Dae-young said, his voice taking on a quality that might have been pride or might have been grief. "We trained 140 dogs during my time there. Only 30 survived the process. The others were too soft, or too aggressive, or simply unlucky." "Your father, what did he teach them to detect?" This was the test, the question that would determine whether her cover held or collapsed. "Electronics," Ji-won said, committing to the truth because anything else would be immediately transparent to someone who'd lived that life. "He said the regime was paranoid about recording devices, about defectors who might try to document conditions and smuggle evidence out. He trained dogs to detect the electromagnetic signature of batteries, transmitters, anything that could be used to capture information." Dae-young smiled, and it transformed his scarred face into something almost human. "Your father was Park Sung-ho of the 3rd Training Division. I knew him. We worked together for 6 years before I left." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "He never mentioned me." Ji-won felt the ground shift under her feet. Her father had never mentioned working with anyone, had barely talked about his time in North Korea except in fragments and nightmares. But Dae-young's certainty was absolute, and lying now would destroy everything. He didn't talk about his past much. The memories were too painful. "As they should be," Dae-young said softly. "We did terrible things to those dogs, Mississippi Park. We broke them in ways that couldn't be fixed, turned them into weapons that could never be anything else. Your father hated it, I could see it in his eyes every time we had to put down a dog that failed training. But he was the best trainer I ever worked with, the only one who could create an animal that would detect electronics without destroying everything else in the process." Ji-won's hands were shaking, and she folded them in her lap where Dae-young couldn't see. "Baekdu," she said, making it a statement rather than a question. "You trained him using my father's methods." Dae-young's smile widened. "I bought him in Yenji from a broker who'd smuggled him out of Koreatown. He was 18 months old, already vicious, and the broker said he'd been trained by Park Sung-ho himself before your father defected. I couldn't verify it, your father was already dead by the time I tracked down the broker, but the dog's behavior matched the techniques I'd learned from him. So I continued the training, finished what your father had started, and gave him to my nephew as a gift." The pieces were falling into place now, a picture that Ji-won didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. Baekdu had been trained by her father before he defected, which meant the dog was older than the FBI's file suggested, which meant everything about the timeline was wrong. Her father had left North Korea in 1998, which would make Baekdu at least 9 or 10 years old, ancient for a working dog. But the animal she'd met yesterday had been in perfect condition, muscled and healthy and showing no signs of age. Unless you've been training other dogs, Ji-won said, understanding flooding through her. Baekdu isn't the original. You've been breeding and training replacements, using my father's methods to create a line of dogs that can detect electronics. Dae-young's expression shifted to something like respect. Very good, Mississippi Park. Yes, the current Baekdu is the third generation. The original died in 2019, and his son died last year. This one is from the original's granddaughter, trained from birth using the same methods. My nephew doesn't know, he thinks it's the same dog, and I see no reason to correct him. The important thing is that the technique works, and that your father's legacy continues even though he's gone. If your jaw just dropped, smash that subscribe button, because Ji-won just learned that the dog she's been bonding with is part of a breeding program that's continuing her father's most traumatic work, and the man across from her thinks he's honoring her father's memory by perpetuating the exact violence that destroyed him. Ji-won forced herself to breathe, to maintain the mask of professional interest while her mind raced through implications. Dae-young had just admitted to running a breeding program for attack dogs trained using North Korean military methods, which meant he had facilities, trainers, resources that went far beyond what the FBI had documented. If she could map that infrastructure, she could dismantle not just the financial operation but the entire trafficking pipeline that used those dogs to guard and control victims. I'd like to see your training facilities, Ji-won said, keeping her voice level. If I'm going to understand how money flows through your organization, I need to understand all of your operations, not just the restaurants. Dae-young studied her for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable. Min-jae said you were thorough. Most bookkeepers are content with spreadsheets and bank statements. You want to see the whole machine. I can't protect what I don't understand, Ji-won said, which was true in both her real role and her cover. And if federal agencies are adapting their investigative methods, we need to be certain that every part of your operation is invisible. Tomorrow, Dae-young said, standing in a smooth motion that belied his age. I'll take you to our primary facility in San Pedro. It's where we process imports, where we handle the logistics that keep our organization functioning. You'll see everything, the shipping containers, the warehouses, the holding areas. And you'll understand why your father's techniques are so valuable to us. Holding areas. Ji-won felt sick. That was the language of traffickers, of people who treated human beings like inventory. I look forward to it, she said, standing as well, knowing that she needed to maintain her cover even as every instinct screamed at her to run. Dae-young walked her to the door, and at the threshold he placed one scarred hand on her shoulder. Your father was a good man, Mississippi Park. He understood that survival requires choices most people aren't willing to make. I hope you've inherited his strength, because the work we do, it tests people in ways they don't expect. Ji-won nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and walked to her car with her spine straight and her hands steady through sheer force of will. She made it 5 miles north on PCH before pulling into a parking lot overlooking the ocean and calling Morrison. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with anger that dissolved into concern when she told him what she'd learned. A breeding program, Morrison said, and Ji-won could hear him typing in the background, already pulling case files and cross-referencing information. That explains how they've maintained operational security for so long. Every time we get close, they rotate dogs, change handlers, shift locations. If Dae-young has been training replacements for 15 years. He's been doing it longer than that, Ji-won interrupted. He knew my father. They worked together in Koreatown, which means he's been using these methods since before he came to the U.S. Morrison, if he's been trafficking defectors and using dogs to control them. We need documentation, Morrison said, cutting through her spiraling thoughts with the cold logic of someone who'd spent 2 decades building prosecutions. Tomorrow, when you visit the facility in San Pedro, you'll wear a button camera. Small enough that the dog won't detect it, embedded in your jacket. You'll document everything, the containers, the holding areas, the dogs, the victims if you can safely photograph them. And if Baekdu detects the camera? Ji-won asked, her voice sharp with fear she couldn't quite suppress. Then you run, Morrison said bluntly. But these cameras are different from the wire. They don't transmit, they record locally, no electromagnetic signature. The dog shouldn't react unless it physically sees the lens. Just keep your jacket closed and your movements natural. Ji-won agreed because she didn't have a choice, and hung up before Morrison could lecture her about operational security or asset management. She sat in the parking lot and watched the ocean turn black as night fell, thinking about her father and the scars on his hands, about Baekdu and the generations of dogs that had been broken to continue his work, about Min-jae and the empire built on suffering that he might or might not understand. The moral calculus she brought into this operation, criminals on one side, law enforcement on the other, had dissolved into something far more complex. Min-jae was a criminal, but he was also a man who'd inherited an organization he might not fully control. Dae-young was a trafficker, but he spoke about her father with genuine respect, seemed to believe he was honoring the memory of a man whose techniques he'd stolen. And Baekdu, the dog that had nearly killed 5 people, had been trained using methods her father had developed, which meant she bore some responsibility for the violence it had caused. The next morning, Ji-won arrived at Baekdu restaurant wearing the jacket Morrison's tech team had modified, a navy blazer with a button camera embedded in the third button down. The lens was smaller than a pinhead, the recording device hidden in the lining, and Morrison had sworn it would be undetectable. She'd tested it in her apartment, recorded 30 seconds of video that showed perfect clarity, and then spent an hour in front of the mirror practicing the posture that would keep the lens pointed forward without appearing unnatural. Min-jae was waiting in his office, Baekdu at his feet, and he smiled when she entered. Uncle called this morning. He said you impressed him, which doesn't happen often. He wants me to accompany you to San Pedro today, partly to show you the operation, partly because he trusts me to evaluate whether you're ready to see it. Ji-won felt her stomach drop. She'd expected to visit the facility with Dae-young, had prepared for his scrutiny, but Min-jae's presence changed everything. The nephew might be less paranoid than the uncle, but he was also more observant, more likely to notice the subtle tells that indicated she was recording. I'm ready, she said, committing because backing out now would destroy her cover completely. They drove south in Min-jae's car, a black Mercedes that cost $120,000 and smelled like leather and the faint ghost of Baekdu's presence. The dog sat in the back seat, head resting on the center console between them, and Ji-won felt its breath on her arm every time Min-jae took a curve too fast. They didn't talk much. Min-jae seemed content to drive in silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or businesses that belonged to the organization. Ji-won used the silence to steady her breathing, to remind herself that the camera was recording, that Morrison and his team would be analyzing this footage within hours of her return. The facility in San Pedro was a warehouse district near the port, industrial buildings that processed goods from shipping containers before distributing them inland. Min-jae pulled into a lot behind a warehouse marked with Korean characters and a faded logo for a trading company, and Ji-won saw 2 men in coveralls standing near a loading dock, smoking and talking in voices too low to hear. They straightened when Min-jae's Mercedes appeared, ground out their cigarettes, and approached with the kind of deference that suggested they knew exactly who was visiting. Stay close, Min-jae said as he opened his door. Some of the workers here don't speak English, and Uncle runs this facility differently than the restaurants. There are rules about who can go where, and breaking them has consequences. Ji-won followed him into the warehouse. Baekdu pressed against her leg like a furry anchor, and felt the temperature drop 20 degrees as they moved from sunshine into shadow. The interior was massive, 50,000 square feet of concrete and steel beams, lit by industrial lights that cast harsh shadows across shipping containers arranged in neat rows. She could smell ocean salt and diesel fuel and something else, human sweat, fear, the particular scent of people living in close quarters without adequate ventilation. If you're feeling that dread in your chest, comment, "No way," because what Ji-won is about to see in this warehouse will force her to choose between completing her mission and becoming complicit in the same trafficking that destroyed her father, and there's no good answer to that equation. Min-jae led her deeper into the warehouse, past containers marked with shipping codes and company logos, and Ji-won's trained eye caught details that the FBI would want: manifest numbers, cargo weights, destination ports. The button camera was recording everything, she reminded herself, capturing evidence that would be analyzed frame by frame. But it felt inadequate, a technological solution to a moral problem that required something more fundamental than documentation. They stopped in front of a container that looked like all the others, 40 feet long, marked with the logo of a Chinese shipping company. Min-jae knocked 3 times, paused, knocked twice more, and Ji-won heard movement inside, shuffling, whispers, the sound of people trying to be silent. A moment later, the container doors opened from the inside, and Ji-won saw what she'd been afraid she'd find. 12 people, maybe more in the shadows, Korean by their features, ranging in age from maybe 20 to 50. They were arranged on makeshift bunks welded to the container walls, and the space smelled like unwashed bodies and the particular desperation of people who'd been confined too long. A woman near the front looked up at Min-jae with an expression that mixed hope and terror in equal measure, and Ji-won realized with sick certainty that these were defectors, people who'd paid Dae-young to smuggle them out of North Korea and now found themselves trapped in a debt they could never repay. "These are Uncle's latest shipment," Min-jae said, his voice neutral, and Ji-won couldn't tell if he was proud of this or simply stating facts. "They arrived 2 weeks ago from Dalian. Once their paperwork is processed, they'll be placed in jobs throughout Los Angeles, restaurants, garment factories, massage parlors. They'll work off their transportation debt over the next 5 to 7 years, and then they'll be free to pursue their own lives." 5 to 7 years. The FBI's file had said the average victim never escaped, that the debt was structured to grow faster than they could pay it down, interest and fees accumulating until death was the only release. Ji-won forced herself to breathe, to maintain the expression of professional interest while the button camera recorded evidence that would hopefully bring this entire operation down. "How do you prevent them from running?" Min-jae gestured to Baekdu, and the dog's ears swiveled forward. "Uncle's dogs are trained to track specific scent signatures. Every person in this container has been documented: hair, skin cells, clothing fibers. If they run, the dogs can find them within 72 hours anywhere in Southern California. And once they're found," he didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. The threat was clear enough. Ji-won knelt down, ostensibly to examine something near the container door but really to steady herself before she said something that would blow her cover. One of the women in the container, young, maybe 25, with hollow eyes and hands that shook, caught her gaze and held it. There was a question in that look, a desperate hope that someone might see her and recognize her humanity. Ji-won wanted to say something, to promise that help was coming, but she couldn't without exposing herself. So she stood, brushed off her knees, and turned back to Min-jae with an expression she hoped read as curiosity rather than horror. "The dogs are the key to the whole operation," she said, keeping her voice level. "Without them, the entire system collapses." "Exactly," Min-jae said, closing the container doors with a metallic clang that sounded like a prison cell locking. "Uncle has invested everything in the breeding program. The dogs are more valuable than the people, in some ways. People are replaceable, there are always more defectors who'll pay for passage. But dogs that can track and detect electronics, those are irreplaceable." They walked through the warehouse, and Min-jae showed her 3 more containers, each holding a dozen or more people in various stages of processing. He explained the financial structure: 50,000 per person for transportation, placed in jobs that paid minimum wage but charged triple market rate for housing and food, interest compounding at rates that would make loan sharks blush. By Ji-won's calculation, running in her head even as she tried to maintain her cover, the average victim would need to work 18-hour days for 15 years to pay off their debt. Most wouldn't survive that long, and Dae-young would simply replace them with new arrivals. Finally, at the back of the warehouse, Min-jae opened a door that led to a separate section, climate-controlled, clean, smelling like antiseptic and dog food. "This is where Uncle keeps the breeding program," he said, and Ji-won stepped through into what looked like a professional kennel. 10 runs, each holding an Akita in various stages of development, puppies in one section, adolescents in another, adults in the back. They all looked like Baekdu, white coats and black eyes, and they all watched Ji-won with the same calculated intensity. These weren't pets. These were weapons in development, each one being conditioned to detect electronics and control human beings. A man in a white coat, 60-something, Korean, with the careful posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime around dangerous animals, approached them. He spoke rapid Korean to Min-jae, gesturing to one of the adolescent dogs, and Min-jae nodded. "Dr. Huang says this one is ready for the final phase of training. He wants to know if you'd like to see a demonstration." Ji-won nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and Dr. Huang led them to a training ring, a circular space marked with tape on the concrete floor. He brought out the adolescent dog, maybe 18 months old, muscles still developing but already showing the kind of definition that suggested intensive conditioning. The dog sat at Dr. Huang's feet, every muscle locked in perfect discipline, and Ji-won recognized the posture from her father's nightmares. This was a dog that had been broken and rebuilt, turned into something that existed only to obey. Dr. Huang pulled a phone from his pocket, and the dog's entire body went rigid. Its lips pulled back from its teeth, a low growl building in its chest, and Ji-won saw murder in its eyes, not the hot aggression of a normal attack dog, but something colder, more systematic. Dr. Huang dropped the phone, and the dog exploded forward, covering 10 feet in a single bound. It didn't just attack the phone, it systematically destroyed it, teeth crushing the screen, claws raking the components, tearing it apart with an efficiency that suggested this wasn't aggression but procedure. "That's what your father taught us," Min-jae said, and there was something like awe in his voice. "To create a dog that doesn't just react to threats, but dismantles them systematically. The regime used these dogs to guard political prisoners, to prevent them from documenting conditions or contacting the outside world. Uncle adapted the technique for our needs. Instead of guarding prisoners, we're protecting our organization from surveillance." Ji-won felt bile rise in her throat. Her father had created this, not intentionally, not with the understanding that his techniques would be used for trafficking, but his hands had shaped the methods that made this possible. And now she was standing in a warehouse watching those methods perpetuate themselves, generation after generation, while people died in shipping containers 50 feet away. Comment, "I can't," if you're feeling Ji-won's horror, because she's about to realize that the button camera recording all of this is about to make her a target of the very dogs her father trained, and her only warning will be when Baekdu's behavior changes from protective to predatory. They spent another hour in the warehouse, Min-jae walking her through the financial records that Dr. Huang maintained, expenses for dog food and training equipment, revenue projections based on the number of defectors they expected to process in the next quarter, profit margins that treated human beings as inventory with depreciation schedules. Ji-won's button camera recorded everything, the lens capturing details that would be critical evidence in the prosecution Morrison was building. But with every minute, she felt the weight of complicity growing heavier. She was documenting these crimes, yes, but she was also playing a role that required her to appear interested, engaged, complicit. Where was the line between undercover work and active participation? When did gathering evidence become aiding and abetting? Finally, Min-jae checked his watch and gestured toward the exit. "We should go. I have a meeting at Baekdu in 2 hours, and Uncle wants a report on how you handled seeing the operation." They walked back through the warehouse, past the containers holding people whose names Ji-won would never know, and she felt every pair of eyes following her. They thought she was part of this, she realized. They saw her walking beside Min-jae with a dog that could tear them apart, and they assumed she was another predator in a system built on their suffering. The button camera couldn't capture that, the weight of their gazes, the desperation and resignation that marked every face. Evidence was numbers and images, but justice required understanding what those numbers meant, who they represented, what had been lost. In the car driving back to Koreatown, Baekdu rested its head on her shoulder, and Ji-won had to suppress the urge to push it away. The dog trusted her now, or at least, trusted her enough to seek comfort in her presence. But that trust was a weapon Dae-young had forged using her father's methods, and every moment she spent bonding with the dog made the eventual betrayal more complete. She would use this evidence to destroy Min-jae's organization, and Baekdu, innocent in the way that weapons were innocent, would end up in an animal control facility somewhere, probably euthanized because no shelter would adopt a dog trained to kill. "You did well today," Min-jae said, breaking the silence. Most people see that operation and they can't hide their reaction: disgust, fear, moral outrage. You maintained your professional composure. Uncle will be pleased. "It's a business," Ji-won said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I've audited worse." It was a lie. She'd never seen anything worse, had never confronted the reality of human trafficking in such direct terms. But Min-jae nodded, accepting her statement, and Ji-won realized that he genuinely didn't understand the moral weight of what he'd just shown her. This was normal to him, the background reality of an empire he'd inherited. The trafficking wasn't a moral choice, it was simply how the organization functioned, as natural and unremarkable as paying rent or filing taxes. They arrived back at Baekdu restaurant, and Min-jae walked her to her car, Baekdu trailing behind them like a white shadow. "I'll need your preliminary analysis by Friday," he said, shifting back to business as if the last 3 hours hadn't happened. "Focus on the property transfers, that's where we're most vulnerable to federal scrutiny. If you can restructure those transactions to appear more organic, we can reduce our audit risk by 70%. Ji-won nodded, already planning how she would embed evidence in that analysis, how she could create a financial map that would lead the FBI directly to Dae-young's trafficking operation while appearing to protect it. "I'll have it ready. But I'll need access to your uncle's shipping records, the real ones, not the sanitized versions you show customs." Min-jae smiled, and for the first time Ji-won saw genuine warmth in his expression. "You're exactly what we needed, Ji-won. Someone who understands that protecting an organization means seeing all of it, even the parts we keep hidden." He paused, his hand moving to Baekdu's head in that reflexive gesture of affection. "Uncle wants to meet with you again, privately, before you submit your analysis. He has concerns about federal asset forfeiture laws and how they might apply to our real estate holdings. Can you meet him tomorrow evening?" Another private meeting with Dae-young, another chance to gather evidence but also another opportunity for exposure. Ji-won felt the button camera pressing against her chest, a reminder that she was already compromised, already in deeper than Morrison had planned. "Of course. Same location?" "No," Min-jae said, his expression shifting to something more serious. "His training facility in the Angeles National Forest. It's where he keeps the adult dogs between assignments. He wants you to see the full scope of the breeding program, and he thinks the isolation will allow for more candid conversation." Isolation. Ji-won's instinct screamed danger, but she forced herself to nod. "Text me the address. I'll be there." She drove back to her apartment, and the moment she was through the door she tore off the jacket with its hidden camera and called Morrison. He answered immediately, his voice sharp with anticipation. "Tell me you got something." "I got everything," Ji-won said, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the jacket's lining, extracting the recording device. 12 victims in one container, at least 40 more in the warehouse, financial records that document the entire operation. "Morrison, they're using dogs trained with my father's methods to control these people, to prevent them from escaping or communicating with the outside world." "Send me the footage," Morrison said, and she could hear him moving, probably already pulling his team together for analysis. "This is exactly what we need to move on the entire organization, not just Min-jae and his uncle, but everyone involved in the trafficking pipeline. Ji-won, this is career-making work. This is why you joined the bureau." But Ji-won wasn't thinking about careers or prosecutions. She was thinking about the woman in the container, the one who'd looked at her with desperate hope. She was thinking about Baekdu, resting its head on her shoulder as if she were someone worth trusting. She was thinking about Min-jae, who'd shown her the worst parts of his empire without apparent guilt, who seemed to genuinely believe he was running a business rather than perpetuating systematic abuse. "He wants me to meet his uncle tomorrow," she said, plugging the recording device into her laptop and watching the file transfer begin. "At a training facility in the Angeles National Forest. Isolated, private, just me and Dae-young and however many attack dogs he keeps there." Morrison was silent for a moment. "That's a risk. If he suspects you're law enforcement, that's where he'd make his move. But it's also an opportunity. If you can document the training facility, we can seize the entire breeding program as evidence of systematic trafficking." "And if the dogs detect another camera?" Ji-won asked, hearing the edge of hysteria in her own voice. "Then you run," Morrison said bluntly. "But Ji-won, you've come too far to back out now. These people in those containers, they're counting on you to finish this. Your father would have wanted you to finish this." Ji-won hung up before Morrison could say anything else, before he could weaponize her father's memory any more than he already had. She watched the file transfer complete, saw the footage appear on her screen, grainy, slightly fish-eyed from the camera's wide angle, but perfectly clear. There was the warehouse, the containers, the people inside them. There was Min-jae explaining the financial structure, Dr. Hwang demonstrating the dog's training, the breeding program laid out in perfect detail. Evidence that would destroy an empire. She thought about her father, about the scars on his hands and the nightmares that had defined his last years. He'd created these techniques to survive, to serve a regime that would have killed him for refusing. And now those techniques were being used to perpetuate the exact kind of trafficking he'd escaped from. If he were alive, what would he want her to do? Complete the mission, bring down the organization, save the people in those containers? Or protect Min-jae, who'd been kind to her in his way, who'd trusted her with the truth of his empire? Or protect Baekdu, innocent victim of a cycle of violence that had started long before the dog was born? There was no good answer. Every choice carried consequences that would destroy someone, and Ji-won was beginning to understand that undercover work wasn't about gathering evidence, it was about deciding whose suffering mattered more, who deserved protection and who deserved punishment. The FBI had presented it as simple: criminals on one side, victims on the other, justice in the balance. But the reality was far more complex, and Ji-won was standing in the middle of that complexity with no clear path forward. If you've been reading this far and your heart is breaking, type "heartbroken," because tomorrow Ji-won is going into the mountains alone to meet a man who's built an empire on the techniques her father created, and she's going to have to choose between completing her mission and protecting the people she's come to care about, and there's no version of this story where everyone survives. The next evening, Ji-won drove north into the Angeles National Forest, following GPS coordinates that Dae-young had texted her that afternoon. The road climbed through pine forest and granite outcrops, growing narrower and more isolated with every mile. She'd called Morrison before leaving, told him where she was going, and he promised that an FBI tactical team would be staged 10 miles away, ready to extract her if she triggered the emergency signal. But 10 miles in these mountains might as well be 100, by the time they reached her, whatever was going to happen would be finished. The training facility appeared as she rounded a curve, a cluster of buildings and chain-link enclosures carved into a clearing, surrounded by forest that stretched for miles in every direction. She counted 5 separate enclosures, each holding multiple dogs, and she could hear them barking as her car approached, a chorus of warning that echoed through the trees. Dae-young stood near the largest building, wearing work clothes instead of the expensive suits he'd worn at his house, and Ji-won saw the scars on his arms more clearly now: burns, claw marks, the physical record of decades working with animals that would rather kill him than obey. "Mississippi Park," he said as she stepped out of her car. "Welcome to the heart of our operation. Everything you saw yesterday in San Pedro, the control, the discipline, the systematic approach, it all starts here." Ji-won followed him into the main building, which turned out to be a training facility that would have impressed professional dog handlers. Obstacle courses, bite sleeves hanging on racks, training dummies that smelled like blood and fear. But it was the back room that made her stop dead, a surgical space, complete with operating table and veterinary equipment, where Dae-young clearly performed procedures that no licensed vet would touch. This is where we condition the final behaviors, Dae-young said, his scarred hands moving over the equipment with casual familiarity. The genetic traits are important, the Akita's natural aggression, the intelligence, the loyalty. But the specific skills, the electronics detection, the systematic attack patterns, those have to be physically reinforced. Your father understood that. Tame is the only reliable teacher for dogs bred to work in extreme conditions. Ji-won thought of the button camera she'd left in her car, of Morrison's instructions to document everything. But bringing electronics into this facility would trigger every dog in the place, and she'd be torn apart before she could reach her car. So instead she committed details to memory, cataloging everything she saw for the report she'd write later, if she survived this meeting. My father hated this work, she said, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. He told me once, right before he died, that the worst thing the regime ever made him do was break dogs that didn't deserve to be broken. He said every technique he developed, every method that made those dogs more effective, all of it was purchased with suffering that could never be justified. Dae-young was silent for a moment, and when he spoke his voice carried an edge she hadn't heard before. Your father was weak. Brilliant, but weak. He could create the methods but he couldn't accept the necessity of them. That's why he defected, why he ran rather than continuing the work. But I understood what he couldn't, that survival requires sacrifices. The dogs we break, the people we control, the violence we employ, all of it serves a purpose larger than individual suffering. What purpose? Ji-won asked, knowing she was pushing too hard but unable to stop herself. Trafficking defectors. Building an empire on their slavery. Dae-young's expression hardened. Protecting them. Every person in those containers paid me to escape North Korea, to cross a border that would have meant execution if they were caught. I give them jobs, housing, a chance at a life they never would have had. Yes, they work off their debt, but they're alive, Mississippi Park. They're free in ways they never could have been in the North. Your father benefited from the same system. Someone smuggled him out, someone gave him a job in China that kept him alive long enough to reach South Korea. He paid his debt, just like they're paying theirs. My father worked 3 jobs for 15 years, Ji-won said, her voice shaking with anger she could no longer suppress. He died from liver failure because he couldn't afford medical treatment. He paid his debt with his life, and you're standing here telling me that's protection. He lived, Dae-young said flatly. He escaped a regime that would have worked him to death in a camp. He had a daughter who grew up in America, who got an education, who has opportunities he never dreamed of. That's the cost of survival, Mississippi Park. You don't get to escape hell without paying the ferryman. Ji-won stood in the surgical room and felt the full weight of the moral equation she'd been trying to balance. Dae-young wasn't wrong, exactly. Her father had survived because someone like Dae-young had smuggled him out, had given him work that kept him alive. But the debt had never ended, the cost had continued accumulating until it killed him, and now that same system was perpetuating itself through her presence here. She'd come to document crimes, to gather evidence that would destroy this organization. But what happened to the people in those containers when the FBI moved in? Would they be freed, or would they be deported back to North Korea as illegal immigrants? Would they be treated as victims or as conspirators in their own trafficking? I need to know something, Ji-won said, her voice barely above a whisper. Does Min-jae understand what you're really doing? Does he know about the conditions in those containers, about the debt structure that guarantees most of them will never escape? Dae-young studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. My nephew understands what he needs to understand. He runs the legitimate businesses, maintains the public face of our organization. He knows we help defectors, knows we charge for that service. Whether he chooses to examine the details of how we maintain control, Dae-young shrugged, a gesture that conveyed volumes, that's his decision. Some people prefer not to see the machinery that makes their comfortable life possible. So he's willfully ignorant, Ji-won said. He's practical, Dae-young corrected. He focuses on what he can control, the restaurants, the money, the protection we provide to Koreatown. The rest, he leaves to me. That's how successful organizations work, Mississippi Park. Delegation based on expertise. They walked outside, and Dae-young led her to the nearest enclosure where an adult Akita watched them with predatory focus. This is Baekdu's mother, he said, his voice carrying a note of pride. 14 years old, still working, still perfect in every way that matters. Your father trained her grandmother in Koreatown before he defected. The bloodline goes back 6 generations, each one refined to be more effective than the last. Ji-won looked at the dog and saw in its eyes the same flat calculation she'd seen in Baekdu, the absence of anything resembling joy or play or the normal emotional range of a healthy animal. This was what her father's techniques created, creatures that existed only to serve, to obey, to inflict violence on command. And every generation perpetuated that trauma, passing it down through genetics and conditioning until the original suffering became invisible, normalized, just the way things were. I can't do this, Ji-won said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Dae-young turned to her, his scarred face expressionless. Can't do what, Mississippi Park? Any of it. The analysis, the financial restructuring, playing bookkeeper for an organization that treats human beings like inventory. I thought I could separate the work from the reality, but I can't. My father couldn't, and neither can I. The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 20 degrees. Dae-young's hand moved to his belt and Ji-won saw the knife there, the kind of weapon that suggested he'd had this conversation before with other people who developed inconvenient consciences. The dogs in the enclosures had gone silent, sensing the shift in tension, and Ji-won calculated the distance to her car, 50 feet, too far to reach before Dae-young could stop her, and even if she made it to the car the dogs would run her down before she cleared the property. Your father made the same speech, Dae-young said softly. Right before he defected. He told me he couldn't continue the work, couldn't keep breaking dogs for a regime he'd stopped believing in. I told him then what I'll tell you now, you don't get to choose when the work ends. You made a commitment to my nephew, to our organization. Breaking that commitment has consequences. I understand, Ji-won said, her hand moving slowly toward her pocket where the emergency signal device was hidden. One press, and the FBI tactical team would move in. But they were 10 miles away, and even if they drove fast they'd need 20 minutes to reach this location. She'd be dead long before then, torn apart by the dogs or killed by Dae-young's knife, another body buried in the forest where no one would ever find it. But then Baekdu appeared, emerging from the main building where Dae-young must have kept him, and the dog's presence changed everything. It crossed the clearing in 3 bounds, positioned itself between Ji-won and Dae-young, and its body language was unmistakable, protective, defensive, ready to fight. The dog that had been trained to kill on command, that had hospitalized 5 people, was now protecting her from its own trainer. Dae-young stared at the dog, his expression shifting from anger to something like wonder. Impossible. Baekdu doesn't have protective instincts. We trained those out of him. My father's techniques, Ji-won said, understanding flooding through her even as her hand remained on the signal device. You refined the aggression and the obedience, but you couldn't eliminate the bond between trainer and dog. Baekdu recognizes something in me, my father's scent, maybe, or the genetic markers we share. He's protecting me the way he would have protected his original trainer. Dae-young's hand dropped from his knife, and he shook his head slowly. Your father. After all these years, his ghost is still interfering with my work. He stepped back, giving Ji-won space, and his scarred face softened into something almost human. I'll give you a choice, Mississippi Park. The same choice I gave your father. You can leave, walk away from our organization, disappear, and I'll tell Min-jae you weren't suitable for the position. But if you leave, the people in those containers stay there. Their debts continue accumulating, their suffering continues, and you'll know that you had a chance to change the system from the inside and chose not to take it. Or? Ji-won asked, not releasing the signal device but not pressing it either. Or you stay, Dae-young said. You complete your analysis, you restructure our finances, and you use that access to actually improve conditions for the people we're helping. Push for debt forgiveness programs, better housing, medical care. Min-jae will listen to financial arguments, show him that healthy workers are more productive, that reducing debt loads increases long-term revenue. You can't destroy the organization without destroying everyone who depends on it, but you can reform it from the inside. Make it what it claims to be, a protection service rather than a slavery operation. It was the same devil's bargain her father must have faced, the choice between escape and complicity, between individual morality and collective good. Walk away and preserve her integrity but abandon the victims, or stay and become part of the system while trying to change it from within. There was no clean answer, no path that didn't require sacrifices that would haunt her forever. Final comment prompt: if you need to know what Ji-won chooses, comment, I need part 2, because this is the moment where everything changes, where she has to decide who she really is and what she's willing to sacrifice to save people she'll never meet, and the consequences of that choice will reshape not just her life but the entire criminal empire that her father's techniques helped create. Ji-won stood in the clearing with her hand on the signal device, Baekdu pressed against her leg, and Dae-young watching her with the patience of someone who'd seen this moment play out before. She thought of Morrison and the FBI team staged 10 miles away, ready to move in and arrest everyone, rescue the victims and dismantle the operation. She thought of Min-jae, who trusted her with the truth of his empire, who might not even understand the full horror of what his uncle had created. She thought of her father, dying in a hospice bed with liver failure and nightmares, never free of the debt he'd paid to escape hell. And she thought of the woman in the container, the one who'd looked at her with desperate hope. She released the signal device. I'll stay, she said, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. But I want conditions. I want access to the complete debt records for everyone in your system, every person you've trafficked, every dollar they owe, every payment they've made. I want authority to restructure those debts based on actual capacity to pay. And I want Min-jae to know the truth about what you're running, because he deserves to make an informed choice about whether to continue his uncle's work. Dae-young's smile was slow, dangerous, and genuine. You're your father's daughter after all. He made similar demands before he left, wanted to improve conditions, reduce suffering, make the operation more humane. I refused then because I didn't have to negotiate. But you're different. You have leverage I didn't account for. He gestured to Baekdu, who hadn't moved from Ji-won's side. The dog trusts you, which means my breeding program depends on your cooperation. The current generation is stable, but the next generation will need training from someone who understands the original techniques. If you refuse, the whole program collapses within 5 years. Then we have a deal, Ji-won said, pulling out her phone and calling Morrison before she could change her mind. When he answered, she spoke carefully, knowing Dae-young was listening. The operation is more complex than we thought. I need more time before we move. At least 6 months to map everything properly. Morrison's voice exploded through the phone, angry and disbelieving. 6 months. Ji-won, we have enough evidence now to move tonight. What the hell are you doing? Building a case that will actually save people, she said, and hung up before he could argue. She'd deal with the FBI later, with Morrison's fury and the betrayal charges that would probably follow. Right now, she had more immediate concerns, like figuring out how to reform a criminal empire from the inside while maintaining her cover, or how to tell Min-jae that his uncle had been lying to him for years, or how to train the next generation of attack dogs without perpetuating the cycle of violence that had destroyed her father. She looked at Baekdu, at the dog that shouldn't have protected her but had, and made a silent promise to the ghost of her father. This time, the story would end differently. This time, someone would break the cycle,